16.5 pounds. Take a second and really let that number sink in. Because for a casual fan, that might sound like a standard off-season fitness goal, something you'd see on a weight loss ad or a New Year's resolution post. But for a professional athlete, already operating at the peak of human physical conditioning, a player whose entire body has been stress-tested, optimized, and weaponized over 6 years of elite competition, 16.5 pounds is not a diet adjustment. It is not a lifestyle change. It is not a trainer's suggestion. That is a complete biological reconstruction. Sophie Cunningham did not tweak her body this offseason. She did not cut back on carbs and add a few extra miles on the treadmill. She dismantled the only version of herself that had ever worked at the professional level, and she rebuilt it from the ground up. She did this while rehabbing a torn ligament in her knee. She did this while managing the psychological weight of an injury that ends careers. And she did all of it while the entire basketball world had its eyes locked on someone else entirely. Here is what you missed. While every sports broadcast, every podcast, every social media algorithm was consumed by the debate around Caitlin Clark's return, two of Clark's closest teammates were quietly executing the most calculated dual transformation in the modern history of women's basketball. Not the loudest, not the most publicized, the most calculated. There is a difference, and that difference is everything. Cunningham rebuilt herself physically from what can only be described as the cellular level up. Every system in her body had to be retaught how to operate inside a lighter, leaner, faster frame. That is not something that happens in a few weeks. That is months of disciplined, unglamorous, painful work done entirely outside the spotlight. And while Cunningham was doing that, Lexi Hull was constructing something else entirely. She was building a private business empire using a strategy so sophisticated that almost nobody in sports media has stopped long enough to properly map it. Hull did not wait for a sponsor to come knocking. She did not sign a deal that someone else controls. She built the asset herself, owns it completely, and positioned it in a way that makes it nearly impossible for the market to ignore. Both of these moves are connected, both of them are deliberate, and neither one of them exists without the most disruptive player to enter women's basketball in a generation standing at the center of it all. So let's pull every thread and connect every single dot. To understand just how radical Cunningham's transformation actually is, you first need to understand who she was for the 6 years before it. Because context is everything here, and the mainstream coverage keeps skipping right past it. Cunningham built her entire professional identity around one thing: physicality, raw, punishing, unapologetic physicality. She was the enforcer on a roster that desperately needed one, the player who set bone-jarring screens that veterans felt for days afterward, the player who absorbed contact in the paint without flinching, who made a very deliberate physical statement every single time an opposing veteran decided to test Indiana's rookie point guard. At 165 pounds, Cunningham carried the structural mass of a player built specifically for contact. That frame was not an accident, it was engineered. Her weight, her strength, her physical presence, that was her brand. That was her role. That was, frankly, her job security. In a league that discards role players the instant they stop being useful, being the most physically imposing player on the floor at any given moment was Cunningham's competitive survival strategy. It was the reason she kept getting a roster spot when plenty of more offensively gifted players did not. And then she watched the film from last season. She studied the numbers, she looked at the system she was being asked to operate inside for the coming year, and she reached a conclusion that required real professional courage to accept. The version of herself that had worked for 6 straight years no longer fit the team she was about to play for. Rather than sit back and wait for a coaching staff to reach that same conclusion and replace her with someone who did fit, she replaced herself first. She dropped from 165 pounds to 148.5, 16.5 pounds, intentionally, strategically gone. Now sit with the full weight of that decision for a moment. No pun intended. Cunningham is currently rehabbing a torn medial collateral ligament. That is not a minor inconvenience. That is a structural knee injury that requires months of careful, calculated rehabilitation.
Every single movement she makes in the gym has to be measured against what her healing joint can safely handle. The margin for error is razor thin.
And inside that already unforgiving recovery window, she chose to simultaneously overhaul her entire body composition. The biomechanics here are not forgiving, and they are worth understanding in detail, because this is where Cunningham's decision reveals just how analytically she approached this problem. In Caitlin Clark's offensive system, wing players must explode in transition the instant a defensive rebound is secured, not a beat later, not after they read the play and decide it's worth running, the instant. Clark's full-court outlet passes have been historically accurate, the kind of passes that make scouts stop the tape and rewind. But the window to receive them is measured in fractions of a second. You have to beat your defender down the floor. There is no negotiating with that requirement. Now consider the physics. Every additional pound of body mass exponentially compounds the stress placed on a recovering knee joint during high-speed deceleration. Every time a player runs a transition lane at full speed and then has to stop, plant, and redirect, which happens on nearly every possession in Clark's system, that recovering joint absorbs the full force of that movement. The heavier the player, the greater the force, the higher the injury risk, and the slower the overall movement speed. Cunningham looked at that equation and made the only call available to a player who wanted to survive and thrive in this system. She stripped down to the leanest, most aerodynamic frame her body could sustain without sacrificing the core strength she still needs to compete physically when the game demands it. But here is where the analysis gets even more interesting, because this decision was never only about protecting her knee. Cunningham studied what happened to Aaliyah Boston at the start of last season, and she studied it closely. Boston entered the year slightly heavier than Clark's system required, not dramatically, not in a way that would have raised flags in any traditional scouting report, just slightly miscalibrated, still operating on the physical settings of the slower, more methodical half-court heavy game she had dominated before Clark arrived and rewired everything. The result was a brutal opening month that nobody who watched it closely will forget. Boston was visibly gassed, visibly working harder than everyone else just to keep pace with a tempo she had not yet adapted to. She was struggling to read Clark's passes early enough, struggling to hit her spots before the defense could recover, struggling to do the things that had made her one of the most efficient forwards in the league in previous seasons. It was not a talent problem. Boston has never had a talent problem. It was a calibration problem. Her body was still running on last year's operating system inside a completely different machine. It took weeks of brutal in-season physical adaptation before Boston finally started to unlock what she was genuinely capable of inside the new system. Weeks of games where Indiana was leaving efficiency on the table because one of their best players was playing catch-up with her own conditioning. Cunningham watched every single minute of that process and made a decision. She was not going to waste a single game on the same learning curve, not one. She showed up to training camp already transformed, already running, already operating as a catch-and-shoot weapon, a player who connected on 43% of her three-point attempts last season, now capable of reaching those spots faster than at any point in her entire professional career. When Clark releases a transition outlet, Cunningham intends to already be standing in the corner waiting for it, not arriving, not sprinting to catch up, waiting. That is what 16.5 pounds actually means in competitive terms. Now, let's shift to Lexi Hull, because what she is building deserves far more attention than it has received, and the way it connects to everything happening around Caitlin Clark is one of the most strategically sophisticated stories in the entire league right now. Hull is launching a direct-to-consumer cosmetics brand called 4A, built specifically for high-performance athletes. On the surface, when you read that description, it sounds like another athlete side project, another famous face lending their name to a product line, another endorsement dressed up as entrepreneurship. Scratch beneath that surface, and you find one of the most intelligent business constructions in the history of WNBA role players. Here is the core mechanic that makes this different from every other athlete brand you have seen. The single most expensive cost in any direct-to-consumer business is customer acquisition. Getting a stranger to stop scrolling, notice your product, feel enough curiosity to click, and then actually convert into a paying customer. That process costs money, a lot of it. Most brands burn through millions of dollars in digital advertising just to get a potential customer to look at their product for 3 seconds. The conversion rates are brutal, the competition is suffocating, and the vast majority of direct-to-consumer brands that launch with significant fanfare never turn a sustainable profit, because the cost of finding customers consistently outpaces the revenue those customers generate. Hull does not have that problem. She already has the audience. Every single time Lexi Hull steps onto the court alongside Caitlin Clark, millions of eyes are engaged. Not thousands, millions. Every pre-game tunnel walk, every post-game interview, every piece of social content that features Indiana Fever players, that is organic, high-engagement reach that a traditional brand would spend millions of dollars to replicate and still probably fall short. Hull is converting her proximity to the single most watched player in women's sports into a private business asset that she owns completely. No corporate sponsor sitting above her, no middleman extracting a cut, no approval process controlled by someone else's legal team. She owns the asset. She controls the brand. She captures the revenue directly. This is what analysts have started calling the Clark halo effect, operating at its most sophisticated and deliberate level. Clark generates attention the way gravity generates pull, constantly, inevitably, without any effort required. The spotlight follows her everywhere she goes, and the players standing in her orbit who truly understand the economics of that proximity are not sitting around waiting for the league to compensate them fairly for the value they generate. They are building independent revenue streams designed to capture the overflow directly, and they are building them now, while the attention is at its absolute peak. Hull is not riding Clark's coattails. She is doing something far more interesting. She identified a structural market inefficiency. Athlete-specific cosmetics for high-performance women, recognized that she had access to the most powerful organic marketing engine in women's sports, and built a business designed to exploit both of those realities simultaneously. That is not a side project. That is a strategic play that most professional athletes with far larger platforms have never thought to execute. Now, here's the layer that has the potential to unravel everything that both Cunningham and Hull are building, and it is the variable that deserves far more serious discussion than it is currently getting. The Indiana Fever hired Stephanie White as head coach this offseason. White is an experienced coach with deep roots in the league, and on paper, the hire reads as a stabilizing move for a franchise that went through significant growing pains last season. But here is the credible concern that people who closely study this roster keep raising, and it is not a small concern. White brings deep ties to the league's established veterans. The fear, grounded in real evidence from how veteran-heavy coaching decisions played out last season, is that she could implement a traditional rotation built around seniority rather than efficiency data. Slower pace, more distributed touches, a system calibrated to keep the locker room politically comfortable rather than to maximize what this specific roster is capable of at its absolute best. On paper, that approach sounds like experienced, balanced team management. In practice, inside this specific situation, it would be an act of competitive self-destruction. The data from last season is not ambiguous on this point. It is not a matter of interpretation or analytical preference. The numbers are clear. Every time the previous coaching staff chose to bench Lexi Hull in favor of slower, higher-usage veterans, the offense shut down. Not slowed down, shut down. Ball movement stopped. Floor spacing collapsed. Clark was funneled into contested isolation possessions that stripped away every single dimension that makes her the most dangerous point guard operating in the sport today. The team became a fundamentally different and dramatically worse basketball team every time that rotation decision was made. And every time Hull returned to the starting five alongside Clark and Cunningham, the system reactivated, like a switch being flipped. Passing lanes reopened. The transition game accelerated back to its natural speed. The mathematical nightmare of defending three legitimate floor spacers simultaneously with a historically accurate playmaker threading passes through every gap came back to life.
The film on this is not a matter of debate. The lineup combination that features Hull alongside Clark and Cunningham produces the best version of this team by a margin that is significant, measurable, and consistent.
Whether Stephanie White follows that data or defers to veteran roster politics because it is the single most important variable heading into this season, every other storyline, every individual transformation, every business move being made in the orbit of this roster, all of it feeds into that one question. Because if the coaching decision goes the wrong direction, none of the adaptation matters. The WNBA is fracturing right now, and the dividing line has absolutely nothing to do with talent. On one side of that line are the players who looked honestly at what the Clark economy actually demands, understood it precisely, and made the unglamorous, uncomfortable, often painful decision to rebuild themselves to meet it. Cunningham stripped away a 6-year professional identity, the physicality that had defined her, protected her, kept her employed when less versatile players were let go, and re-emerged as a transition weapon calibrated for the fastest offensive system in the league. She did it on a torn ligament. She did it without being asked. She did it before anyone else in her position would have felt the pressure to. Hull locked down a defensive role that most players at her level would consider thankless and invisible. She became the player who does the work that does not show up in box scores, the work that does not generate individual highlights, the work that most players with scoring ability would resist accepting. And then, rather than resent the visibility that role provides, limited, unglamorous, completely overshadowed by the player she guards the ball for, she turned that visibility into the foundation of a personal business empire worth more than any single endorsement deal the league could have offered her. These are not players who got fortunate. They are not players who benefited from being in the right place at the right time without understanding why or how. These are professionals who saw the trajectory of their sport clearly before it fully arrived, identified exactly where that trajectory was going, and did the grinding, unflashy, unsexy work of positioning themselves directly inside it, months before it became obvious, months before the mainstream coverage caught up. On the other side of that dividing line are the players still fighting the new reality, players demanding that the system bend around their preferences and their established roles, players expecting playing time based on seniority rather than what the efficiency data says about their actual contribution to winning. Players who built their professional identities inside a version of this league that no longer exists and are refusing, consciously or not, to accept that the ground has shifted permanently beneath them. Those players will be phased out, not because they lack skill. Skill is not the issue. In a league evolving at this velocity, talent without adaptation is not neutral. It is already a liability. And the teams that understand that reality are already making decisions accordingly. Cunningham's bet is placed. The weight is gone, the frame is rebuilt, and the clock on her knee rehab is ticking toward a season that will either validate every painful, calculated decision she made this offseason or expose the limits of what any individual player can physically reconstruct in a single window. Hull's business is being built in real time, compounding with every game Clark plays, every eyeball the Fever attract, every organic piece of content that puts the Indiana roster in front of a new audience that Hull is now positioned to convert. And somewhere inside that locker room, the most consequential decision nobody is loudly debating is quietly approaching. Whether a new head coach trusted the data that her own roster generated last season, or whether she defaulted to the comfortable politics of veteran deference, that answer is coming. It will arrive the moment the rotation is announced. It will be confirmed the moment the pace data from the first few games starts populating, and it will define, more than any individual transformation or any individual business move, the entire ceiling of what this franchise is actually capable of becoming. The players who did the work are ready. The question is whether the coaching will meet them there.
Because if it does not, if the data gets overruled by politics, if the most efficient lineup in the league gets broken up in favor of seniority, then the most fascinating dual transformation in modern women's basketball will have been executed perfectly inside a system that was never willing to let it fully breathe. And that would be the real story. Not the weight loss, not the brand launch, the story of a franchise that had every piece in place and still found a way to get in its own way. That answer is coming. Make sure you are paying attention when it arrives.